Good morning and welcome. I'm Marty Mallon. I'm a member of the faculty here at Chicago-Kent and privileged to serve as the director of our Institute for Law in the Workplace. And it's my pleasure to welcome all of you here on behalf of the law school to our 36th annual Kenneth M. Piper Lecture. And also a welcome to those who are joining us virtually via the internet as we're streaming live today. I want to thank Virginia Piper for her vision and her philanthropy in endowing this lecture series in memory of her late husband, Kenneth M. Piper, who was a senior labor relations executive with Motorola and Bausch & Lomb. The Piper Lecture provided the foundation from which we built our labor and employment law program here at Chicago-Kent, including our JD certificate program in labor and employment law, our public conferences and public lectures, and our two publications, the Employee Rights and Employment Policy Journal and the Illinois Public Employee Relations Report. Our final public event of this academic year will take place on Lucky Friday, the 13th of June, when we will be partnering with Region 13 of the National Labor Relations Board to present a day-long conference on hot topics in contemporary labor relations law. And there's information on that program out on the table where you signed in this morning. And we already have a busy fall planned for the next academic year. On September 18th, we will host our annual conference on federal sector labor relations and labor law. On November 14th, we will be partnering with the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service to run our biannual conference for Midwest labor arbitrators. And on December 5th, we'll be partnering with the Illinois Labor Relations Board and the Illinois Educational Labor Relations Board to sponsor our annual conference on Illinois public sector labor relations law. I want to thank the members of our Endowment Advisory Board, Margaret Angelucci from Asher Gittler, Lisa Calloway from Clark Baird Smith, Terry Creamer from Franzik Radlett, Stan Eisenstein from Katz Friedman, Marisol Hernandez from Jacobs Burns, Wes Kennedy from Allison Slutsky and Kennedy, Shelley Liapez from CNA, Susan Mata from Carmel Sharon, Peter Orr, the Regional Director of the National Labor Relations Board, Pat Slovak from Schiff Hardin, and Anna Wermuth from Meckler-Bulger-Tilson. I also want to thank two former members of our Endowment Advisory Board who before leaving the board were very much involved in planning this year's program. And those were Lisa Moss of Carmel Sharon and Phil Miscamera, who at the time was with Morgan Lewis and Bacchius, and of course now is serving as a member of the NLRB. I also want to thank our wonderful administrative staff of our Department of Continuing Legal Education, who've just done a superb job in coordinating everything for today, Valerie Pereira and Kelly Powers. So when our Endowment Advisory Board met to plan this year's program, a consensus very quickly developed to focus this year's Piper Lecture on the post-recession economy and the workplace. And just as quickly as a consensus developed on the topic, a very quick consensus developed on who we should invite as the principal lecturer. The consensus coalesced around Jared Bernstein, although there was some skepticism among some of the board members. I recall one of them saying, yeah, if you can get him. So we were thrilled when Dr. Bernstein accepted our invitation to present the Piper Lecture. We are really privileged to have him with us because he is one of the preeminent economists on this topic and someone very, very much in demand. Jared Bernstein is currently a senior fellow at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, but immediately prior to his current position, he was the chief economist and economic advisor to Vice President Joseph Biden. And he served as executive director of the White House Task Force on the Middle Class. Before joining the Obama administration, he was senior economist and director of the Living Standards Program at the Economic Policy Institute. And he was also the deputy chief economist at the Department of Labor during the Clinton administration. He is the author of numerous books and articles, both scholarly and academic, and also in the popular press. so he speaks to all audiences. His PhD is from Columbia University, and he has titled his talk today, The Post-Recession Economy, A Return to What? It's my pleasure to welcome to Chicago Kent, Dr. Jared Bernstein.
Thank you. What a nice introduction. Appreciate that, Marty, and thank you for inviting me, and looking forward to hear what Mary Joyce and Mustafa have to say after I'm done. I want to, I don't know that it's that hard to get me, by the way. I am doing a lot of this sort of thing, but in part because I just love to get out of Washington these days. I mean, I like to be home with my wife and kids, don't get me wrong, but we're going to talk a little bit about dysfunctional politics. That actually factors in somewhat importantly into my talk. I want to thank you for coming out today. And those of you who are watching on the internet, you didn't come out today, but I'm glad you're here. Now get out of your pajamas and get dressed. But those of you who are here, I want to thank you for coming out. I understand there are some credits involved for some folks, so we economists think about incentives, so I understand. But I do think that coming out at 11 o'clock in the morning to hear an economics lecture may not be the thing you think about every day when you wake up. Although I did see my old friend Tom Gahagan here, and he probably thinks about that when he wakes up. This is exactly, I think, what we need to be talking about. And I think the intersection of what you do and what I do and what I'm going to talk about is a very important and rich area of discussion. So let me just jump right in. I do have a bunch of slides. And by the way, I'm sure, Marty, we can make these slides available to folks if they want. But they're more just kind of to guide the conversation. We are going to have a chance for some discussion later, Q&A, Marty, I understand. So please save those questions. I have a lapel mic so I can walk around and do my game show host thing a little bit here. This is the outline. I want to talk about the macro picture, kind of looking from 30,000 feet up, more the micro picture, which I think is probably somewhat more germane to the work of the folks in the room. That is, yeah, the economy's been growing, but where's the growth going? Looking at some of the relevant trends in incomes and earnings that actually lead some people to scratch their head when you say it's a post-recessionary climate. There are actually a majority of people, if you believe recent polling, think a recession is still upon the economy, and for understandable reasons when you look at some of the data I'm going to show you. But the macro picture where we're going to start is characterized by something that I've called for a long time the shampoo economy. The shampoo economy is one that goes bubble, bust, repeat. And I think it's important to understand those dynamics, particularly the impact of these, the evolution and the impact of these bubbles. And then finally, we have to talk about the political economy, which is kind of where I live in my day job. I work, as was noted, I've worked for government at times, and now I work for a think tank in DC, and spend a lot of time thinking about the nexus of government and the economy and politics. The response to much of what I'm going to talk about, the policy response, forms a real kernel of my talk, and I'm going to talk about that in a few places. And I want to end by thinking about the implications of the current political dysfunction, at least at the federal level. We had a fun discussion about Chicago politics last night, but I'm an outsider when it comes to that. So let's start with kind of the macro picture, the overview. Why, as you see there, 5 years into an economic recovery, do so many people still think we're in a recession? Now, what do I mean by economic recovery? I suspect there are different levels of kind of knowledge about this terminology, so let me just be clear. If you look at the slide on the left, you see two bars. One says average expansion and one says this expansion. Okay, the way economists date these things, there's this group of nerds up in Cambridge called the Business Cycle Dating Committee, which isn't a lonely hearts club for economists. It's the people who decide when recessions begin and end. They'll tell you that this recession ended in the middle of 2009, and that the economy's been expanding since then. That means basically that GDP has been growing since then, which in fact is the case. Employment took a while to get started. We had what was called a jobless recovery. I'm going to get back to that in a minute. I remember it's not uncommon for people to ask me, well, what do you mean jobless recovery? It sounds like an oxymoron. How can you have a recovery without jobs? Well, if you just look at the broadest measure of the value of the economy, the GDP, or gross domestic product, that's been growing since the trough of the recession or the beginning of the expansion, June 2009. That's 58 months ago. Now, the average post-war expansion lasted, coincidentally, that same number of months. So this is not just a recovery or an economic expansion. It's one that is of average length. It is longish in the tooth. Now, that doesn't mean that a recession's around the corner by any measure. I don't think it is. There's actually quite a lot of variance around this 58 months, and we've had some business cycles that have lasted, expansions, I should say, that have lasted much longer than that. But this is not a new thing. Why then do so many people think we're still not doing so well? Actually, let me just cut to the chase on that. This was going to come later, but let's look at it now. As someone who comments on the economy, I think one of the questions I most often get when I pick up the phone and it's a journalist is some variation on, so how's the economy doing? Jared, how's the economy doing? And I always want to, for some reason, I always want to respond with a Jersey accent. Whose economy are you talking about? Whose economy are you talking about? Because there are different economies out there, and they're doing differently for different people. Now, as I've mentioned, the broadest measure of the value of goods and services have been growing consistently since mid-2009. It's up 11%. All of these are in real terms, adjusted for inflation. Corporate profitability is at an all-time high if you measure it as a share of national income. It's never been higher. I've got data going back to 1929. The S&P 500, the equity, that index of the equity market, up 80% real. Median household income down. It's actually down 3% real. I just looked in my hotel room. I saw they had a new update last night. So that's not down 5%, it's down 3%. It doesn't matter. The bar goes down. Even if the bar was flat, it wouldn't be going up. So clearly, the growth that we've had has eluded the middle class in a big way. Now, why 5 years into an economic expansion do we have a picture like that? Well, I have four reasons listed there. The first one is one that's particularly interesting to me as someone who, most economists who think about this stuff really have to be experts on the ideology of this shampoo economy. You've really got to start thinking about that because it's a fundamental problem. And there was a debt bubble that it was in the housing market. It was certainly present in Illinois. We saw it across the country. Actually, where I live in Washington, Alexandria, that area, there wasn't much of a bubble. But throughout most of the country, there was. And that bubble, that's a debt bubble. That was a bubble that was driven by lending and borrowing in the housing market. And that bubble, when it burst, which was sometime around late 2006, 2007, as I'll show you in a minute, has had particularly damaging effects and been particularly difficult to recover from. And I argue here that debt bubbles are actually more damaging than equity bubbles. If you think about the dot-com bubble in 2000, let me give you a simple example. You have shares of Pet Rocks or whatever, some kind of inflated, bubbly stock, and they're doing okay. And then the bubble bursts, and on Friday your shares are worth $10,000, and on Monday they're worth $5. Mark to market, that's what the economists call it. It's just a very kind of fast and rip the Band-Aid off kind of correction. Well, in debt markets, it doesn't work that way. Banks can extend and pretend. Banks can hold loans even if those loans are non-performing. It's in the bank's interest sometimes to do so. It can be in the borrower's interest sometimes to do so. And it just takes a lot longer. I can get into more details, but in the interest of time, I'm not going to say much more about that right now. It just takes a lot longer to grow out of a debt-driven bubble and bust than an equity-driven bubble and bust. Unless, and I think this is an important point, unless you really do something about it. As you'll see, key to my talk will be policy responses. I thought the economics writer Matt Iglesias had a good point on this. People say, and there's some famous work by two economists named Reinhardt and Rogoff, people say that these, what I just said, that these debt bubbles are particularly pernicious and hard to grow out of. What Iglesias said was, well, that's a little bit like saying it's dangerous to drive in the fog, and you better slow down. Well, that's true, but there are things you can do when you're driving in the fog. You can put on fog lights. You can use radar. Essentially, it's wrong to conclude that because a recession was caused by this as opposed to that, a bursting debt bubble as opposed to a bursting equity bubble, that we're stuck with it for 5 or 6 years. The reason we are where we are, this is one of my punchlines, the reason we are where we are is because of an inadequate policy response, and I'll get to that in a minute. Now, there was a huge, if you look at the top graph here, there was a huge loss of housing wealth. This is owner's equity in real estate, and you can see a decline that's actually, those numbers are in billions on the y-axis. So that's 14 trillion down to like 6 trillion. So that's a loss when the housing bubble burst. That's a loss of about 8 trillion in housing wealth. Now, you might think, well, it's just paper wealth. It doesn't really matter. Your house was worth X on 1 week, and then a couple of months later, it was worth 2/3 X or 1/2 X or something like that. Now, obviously, it's a big problem if you're underwater and all that, but how does that affect the macroeconomy? Well, it affects it through something called the wealth effect. Every time people lose $1 of wealth, they tend to spend a little bit less. Now, we have a 70% consumption economy in the United States. Actually, in Europe, it's 55%. So we are much more buyers and shoppers than other folks around the globe. That probably won't surprise you. I have 2 young kids, so it doesn't surprise me. But when you lose 8 trillion in wealth, and every dollar of lost wealth has a wealth effect of 3 to 5 cents, now you're talking 300, 400 billion of lost consumption. That's a couple of % of GDP. So that begins to explain why a huge loss of housing wealth as a result of a debt bubble could lead to a protracted downturn. There were also serious global imbalances, and I will come back to this. The bottom slide here shows the trade surplus or the trade deficit as a share of GDP. So every year we trade with other countries. I happen to think that's a good thing. This is not a protectionist rap at all. I myself benefit extensively. I benefit extensively from cheap goods that are imported from abroad, and I'm sure you do as well. So there's nothing wrong with expanded trade. There's something very wrong with persistently imbalanced trade, with essentially importing more than you export year after year after year to the tune of 4 or 5% of GDP, as you can see at the right before the recession hit. This is a particular problem in the job market, because what that means when you're buying more from abroad than they're buying from you is that on net, you're exporting labor demand, you're exporting jobs. So again, nothing wrong, a lot right about globalization and global trade, but the persistence of trade deficits is another reason why the recession has been so difficult. It was set up with some very troubling imbalances. A housing bubble that you see in the top graph with a big wealth effect, trade deficits with kind of a certainly making it very tough for the job market, particularly manufacturing, by the way, which is not an immaterial story here in this part of the country. Manufacturing employment did very poorly in the 2000s because we had such persistent trade deficits in manufactured goods. So how did we respond to that policy-wise? Well, part one, because I'm going to get back to this. As was mentioned, I was a proud member of the economics team of the Obama administration in some very tough times. In fact, it's interesting, I hadn't thought about this. I'm sure I've been in Chicago many times since, but the first meeting of the Obama economics team took place in Chicago in December 2008. I was here. I remember sitting in the high floor of some building with the snow swirling outside and just a mixture of awe to be sitting next to this historic president-elect and vice president and this, I thought, pretty cool economics team, and dread if you listen to the topic of the conversation, which was just the extent to which the economy was really beginning to tank. We didn't know it at the time, but in that quarter, the fourth quarter of 2008, GDP contracted by an annual rate of 8%. Now, I don't know if you know those numbers, but that's an unheard of outside of Great Depression. That's a horrific contraction. So we snapped into action and passed a stimulus bill less than a month after the president took office, and the record shows that it was effective. I'm happy to defend that in Q&A if you want, but it was effective. But there was a critique, and I think a trenchant one. Paul Krugman, sort of a leader of this school, that says, yes, it was effective, but it was too small. It wasn't large enough to meet the magnitude of the demand contraction that happened. I actually thought that it was I feel quite confident in asserting that the stimulus, or the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, the ARRA, was the largest package one could have gotten at the time, given the politics, as well as the challenges of efficient implementation. And I thought it was implemented efficiently, for which I give the vice president a fair bit of credit. So I wouldn't say that it was too small. I would say it didn't last long enough. As I mentioned, when you're driving through the fog, yes, you have to drive more slowly, but you can also take actions to make your way through the fog safer. And the analogy here would have been to go back to the stimulus well more than we did, and we did go back. But I don't know that it was too small for an initial jolt. I think based on the trajectory of the economy, we needed to do more over time. 1/3 of the stimulus were tax cuts. And that's a very helpful political selling point, as you can imagine. But it's a pretty indirect way of stimulating the economy. People can save tax cuts. If they save them, they're not boosting consumption. And I told you about our 70% consumption economy. They can buy imported goods with their tax cuts, and that just stimulates somebody else's economy. The messaging and the selling of the Stimulus Act has been criticized, and I, for one, take those criticisms. But again, it was well implemented. The Federal Reserve responded aggressively and continues to do so. To this day, the Federal Reserve is engaged in considerable monetary stimulus to try to help get the economy back on track, and it has helped, but they can't do it by themselves. And then finally, there were stabilization policies. Banks, credit markets, housing finance, autos. It's a very salient topic again in this part of the country. The supporting of GM and Chrysler was a non-trivial part of the stabilization policies we engaged in. At the time, I think one of the important questions is how you diagnose the problems of the financial sector. Is the financial sector illiquid, meaning that the credit markets are just kind of jammed up for a while? Or is there an insolvency problem? And I'm just kind of putting that out there as an example of the way policymakers were thinking at the time. If you're looking at a liquidity issue where the veins of capital just are corroded a bit, and you need to temporarily boost liquidity, that's one set of solutions, and that's kind of the path that we followed. If it's more an insolvency problem, then you have to talk about actually resolving institutions in a way that really wasn't done. So largely, the conclusion was we were looking at liquidity problems. Okay. So those are, in some ways, kind of the conventional economic wisdom of what happened, how we got into the mess, why the mess was deep, and some of the policy responses that I think were helpful but limited. But there's another very important backdrop that I suspect will resonate with folks here, many of whom I know from just conversations I've had since I've been here, deal with labor market issues at a pretty granular level. The other problem, the other imbalance, the other, I think very important factor that has made things tough this time around has been the extent of inequality embedded in the economy, the extent to which growth has been channeled so much to the top of the pay scale through profitability, through assets versus paychecks, and how so little has gone to, in this case, the typical or median household. The median is the 50th percentile. And this is a very dramatic slide. It just shows, and I like these data because they come from the Social Security Administration. So these are administrative data. That's very high quality data for economics. They don't just come from a survey of asking people, what do you make, which is a legitimate thing too. But these are very, very, very high quality data. And all they show is the different trends in your real annual pay, so your annual pay adjusted for inflation, for the top 1%, the next 4%, 95 to 99, the 5% below that, et cetera. Now, if you look at the bottom 90%, you start at the bottom, it's really just an amazing story, in my view. This is, in many ways, this is the most important line in economics right now, that bottom line there. It's the bottom line. The bottom 90%, 90%. I'm not talking about some fringe group at the corners of the economy, some folks who've been left behind by dint of whatever. I'm talking about the bottom 90%. Their earnings are up 17% since 1980, okay? That's what, like 35 years ago now? Now, not only are they only up 17%, but take a closer look at that graph. They only went up for a few years in the mid-90s. There was this New York minute there. Well, this is Chicago, but there was this New York minute there. I used to live in New York, where the job market was really tight. We actually achieved something that I don't call it, that economists call full employment, which is an essential missing ingredient to the American economy that I'm going to get into in a minute. It's kind of been my life's work for the last few years. So there was a full employment economy there in the 1990s, and that boosted earnings for the bottom 90%. But from 79 to 95, and then from 2000 till now, nothing. Where has all the growth been going? Well, there it is. You can't, you'll tell me if I'm wrong, but it's hard not to look at that and see something awry. This looks at it another way, which I find fascinating. And again, I think this will be, and I hope, will be resonant to this audience, many of whom deal with workplaces and the productivity of the workforce. What we've done here is taken hourly compensation, so the hourly pay, and this is basically median pay. It's not exactly median pay, but it's the closest I could get to get a long time series going back to the 1950s. So you take the pay of the typical worker, say a blue-collar worker in a factory. That's a good way to frame this up. You take the pay of a blue-collar worker in the factory and you add on compensation. You can't just look at wages if you want to do a complete job here, and you adjust for inflation. Compare that to productivity growth. From the late 40s to the mid-1970s, the pay of middle-income, blue-collar workers, non-managers and services grew in lockstep with productivity. And by the way, they just about doubled. By 5 minutes, I take it you mean 15 minutes. No, sorry. They just about doubled. But then, look at the separation there. Productivity continues to proceed apace while hourly compensation is flat. The productivity compensation or wage split is at the heart of this inequality dynamic. Okay, what explains these slides? Globalization is certainly part of it. Technology and automation are actually a smaller part, I believe, than is often suggested, but they're there. Not because technology and automation aren't important. They are, and they've been going on forever. I was talking about Mustafa this earlier, and he may speak to this. It's that their trend has been pretty secular. And as you see in the wages, something changed. If you look back here, something changed in the mid-70s. A lot more globalization and trade imbalance since then around a relatively smooth trend of technology and automation. Diminished collective bargaining, big part of the story. A decline in real minimum wages, lower labor standards, financialization, which is devoting more of our economic resources to the finance sector and innovative finance, those were air quotes for those who are listening on the radio, innovative finance versus a kind of more lasting production. And then the absence of full employment. Now, this one is very big to me. Forget the third bar for now in the interest of time. Using a set of statistics on unemployment, which tell you that the Congressional Budget Office develops, they have an unemployment rate which they claim is the lowest unemployment rate you could have without generating spiraling price pressures or inflation. So by that, you can compare the actual unemployment rate to the unemployment rate consistent with full employment. In this period where compensation and productivity grew in lockstep, we were at full employment 70% of the time. That is, we were only, unemployment was too high about 30% of the time. Since then, unemployment has been too high 70% of the time. So certainly a key factor in this split has been the absence of full employment, slack labor markets. Now the current, okay, I have 3 minutes, so I am actually finishing up. The current job market, Marty asked me to wade in on that a bit, it's getting better. It's getting better. It's getting better in Chicago. It's getting better in Illinois. It's getting better throughout much of the country. But it's far from where it should be. This is a very interesting, I write a column for the New York Times on the Economics blog. That's with an X, Economics blog. And I have a piece out today that I commend to you if you want to see it. And one of the things I focus on is the slide on the right, because I think it's quite revealing. It's a little funky. It came out, I just pasted it from the Wall Street Journal, so I'm sorry about that. The one in the paper's better today. But there was a big deal made on the jobs report last Friday, comes out every other, because private sector employment finally regained its lost jobs from the recession. So private sector employment finally regained its pre-recession peak. That's what you see there. See how that line catches up? And everybody was like shooting, not everybody, there were a lot of people kind of like excited shooting off firecrackers. My point is that that's just digging yourself out of a hole. That's getting back to ground zero. The dotted line shows you where we need to be, given the growth in the population over this period. So yeah, it's great to get out of the hole, but we're still behind the 8 ball. The wage trends are stable. Inflation is low. This is actually an important slide, and then I'll conclude. I'm actually colorblind, so I'm not sure what colors these are. But you probably know. If you look at average wages and median wages, what you see there is a little bit of an acceleration in the last few years or so, about the last year or so. They're growing a little faster than they were, but they're still well within kind of a safety zone range in terms of inflation. Actually, the other line, which is the Fed's preferred measure of inflation, the Federal Reserve, is going down. Inflation is growing more slowly, and you can see a gap developing at the end between wage growth and price growth. What that tells you is that, yes, there's a little bit of wage growth, but it's not bleeding into inflation in any way that should make a Federal Reserve economist want to stamp it out. So I've noted that one of the problems driving this inequality is every time you see a little bit of wage growth, these inflation hawks come out and say, oh my God, somebody's getting a pay hike, do something. And that's bad policy. Okay, where do things stand? Yes, we need more stimulus. We're not going to get much out of this Congress. So I think the important thing there is, interestingly, I've seen some state and local governments taking some action. The Port of Cleveland recently is digging out their port to develop a seaway to Europe. And there's some interesting things at the subnational level, but I don't think we're going to get more fiscal policy support from Washington. Hysteresis is this complicated word that just says, if things are bad long enough, a cyclical problem can morph into a structural one. And it's a problem we have to worry about because the long-term unemployed, of which we have a lot of right now, are in danger of staying out of the labor market unless we do a better policy response. The Fed is helping, but they seem to be running out of patience. What do we need going forward? Full employment is critical, and I'm happy to talk about ideas during Q&A. More skills, I think that's probably an obvious solution. And job quality. You know, I'm glad we're having, and I think Mary Joyce is going to speak to this, I'm glad we're having this discussion about minimum wages, about work supports, about health care, which I consider an important work support, because if you look at those wage trends, I think it's incumbent on the public sector to help support low pay through better policy like higher minimum wages, as well as work supports like health care and an earned income tax credit. And finally, it's going to be very hard to get from here to there without more functional politics. Now, as I said, I'm a creature of the swamp of DC, and I'm happy to talk more about this question of political dysfunction during our Q&A, but I do think it's a critical piece of the puzzle. So thank you very much, and let me turn things over to our commentators.
So as we always do with the Piper Lecture, we always ask for commentary from representatives of management and labor. And when we were talking about representatives of management, so well, we focused on who was hurt really badly by the recession and coming back and on the mend. And that, of course, led us to General Motors. And again, we got lucky. We're really thrilled to have with us G. Mustafa Mahatran. Dr. Mahatran is General Motors' chief economist. He has been in that position since 1995. And in that capacity, he leads an economics team that is responsible for assessing the impact of worldwide economic developments on the world's second largest automaker and providing advice to the company on various competitive and economic policy issues. He's an expert on trade policy. He led the GM team responsible for advocating China's accession to the WTO. He was also the lead executive from GM, interacting with U.S. trade negotiators during the U.S.-Korea Fair Trade Agreement negotiations. And currently his team is advising General Motors on the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations and other regional and international trade agreements. He taught as a visiting assistant professor at the University of Notre Dame, and he has also been an adjunct assistant professor at the University of Michigan and at the University of Detroit. His MBA and PhD in economics are from the University of Chicago, so it's a pleasure to welcome back to Chicago and to welcome to Chicago, Kent, Dr. G. Mustafa Mahatran.
Thank you, Marty. It's a pleasure to be here. If you look at your brochure, Jim Glenn, GM Vice President of North America for Labor Relations, was supposed to be here, but our board is meeting in Detroit today and requested that he stay in Detroit. And since the subject was economics, and importantly, the contribution of the U.S. auto industry to the U.S. economy, I was the logical choice, and I would really like to speak about the important role that the U.S. auto industry plays in the overall U.S. economy. I couldn't agree more with Jared that certain decisions that were made at the tail end of the Bush administration and at the start of the Obama administration really set the direction of where the U.S. auto industry is now. We are certainly appreciative of the support that the federal government under both President Bush and Obama gave us. And I think the industry's success at coming back from the depth of the recession has essentially made this a non-issue in the U.S. political debate, because everybody recognizes that what the government did and how the industry responded really has resulted in great success for the U.S. economy and for the U.S. manufacturing sector. But before I get into how the U.S. industry contributes and how GM contributes to the overall economy, let me talk briefly about GM. GM now is a very global company. In fact, we have more revenues coming outside the U.S. than inside the U.S. We have roughly 169 manufacturing operations in 31 countries. And you're all familiar with our global brands, Chevrolet, Buick, Cadillac, GMC, and then some of our foreign brands are Holden, Isuzu, Opel, and Vauxhall. Interestingly, we sell more Buicks in China now than we do in the States. And people always ask me about the active role I played in advocating for China's accession to the WTO. Was it worth it for GM? Well, we sold hardly any cars in GM in the late 90s. And this year we expect to sell more than 3 million. So I would say it was a very successful thing for GM. And I believe we contributed a lot to both the US economy and to the Chinese economy in doing that. I mean, you know, we can debate about globalization and is good or bad, but the fundamental fact is that, you know, in the last 2 decades, 300 million people in China have climbed above the poverty level. I don't think we've ever seen that in human history, and probably won't, because I don't think there are that many people out there, although one keeps hoping that Africa will make the turn. But the point is, the globalization has been good for GM. We have made a significant contribution to the global economy, as well as to the US economy. We now have over 137,000 employees around the world. They're represented by 40 different unions. In the US, we have over 50,000 employees that are represented by the UAW, working in about 40 manufacturing plants. Those employees wouldn't be there if the government hadn't stepped in and if the company and the union had not changed at the bottom of the recession. Now think of what that has resulted in. The US auto industry has led this recovery. Housing has been really slow. As Jared mentioned, that's where the recession really was concentrated. Auto sales have increased from roughly 10 million in 2009 to just under 16 million last year, and we're projecting about 16.5 million this year. Auto production is up nearly 70% over this period, slightly exceeding the actual percentage change in sales. But auto industry alone, even though it accounts for only 3% of the GDP, has been responsible for roughly 13% of the total growth in GDP in the US over the last 4 years. So the industry has been a significant contributor and continues to be a significant contributor. It's one of the few large manufacturing sectors in the US that continues to invest heavily in auto production. And I'm not just talking about GM, I'm also talking about the overall industry. In fact, today we're announcing another significant investment in the Detroit area of roughly $450 million to produce the next generation Chevy Volt and products derived from it. So the industry continues to grow, continues to invest, and importantly, continues to add jobs to the US economy. Just in the last 4 years, the industry has added about 155,000 jobs, and it's no secret that jobs in this industry pay a considerable premium over jobs in other industries, and certainly over the service sector in the US. And importantly, it's not just the industry jobs, it's the spillover, what we call the multiplier. If you define the multiplier really narrowly, just looking at what the auto companies add, what their direct suppliers add, the multiplier is slightly over 3. So for each job that GM creates, there are 3 jobs created in the supplier industries. If you move it forward to dealers, to the impact of community spending, some estimates of the multiplier go as high as 10%, which also explains why so many states offer incredible incentives for auto companies to locate assembly plants in those states. All one has to do is drive down I-75 these days, and you can see the landscape of the economy changing. As you go driving in Michigan, it's GM, Ford, and Chrysler, down to about Toledo, Ohio. Go south of Toledo, all of a sudden you begin to see Honda and a lot of Honda suppliers. You go further down into Kentucky, it's all Toyota. You go further down into Alabama and Florida, it begins to be Hyundai, Daimler, Honda. So essentially the I-75 corridor, you can see what that multiplier means, how that's changing the economic landscape of the country. So I think again, going back to the stimulus programs, what the role of the government in helping GM and Chrysler, it was significant because it has meant that we were able to save hundreds of thousands of very high-paying manufacturing jobs in the US that have significant spillover impacts on the rest of the economy. I mean, take GM alone. We have spent little over $10 billion in the last 4 years in new facilities, new technologies. We have saved about little over 27,000 jobs as a result of those investments. As I mentioned, we just are announcing today a significant investment in Detroit, in our Hamtramck plant. We spent billions in our facilities in Flint to produce new trucks. We continue to invest across the country, whether there's plants in Kansas, plants in Texas. And these are long-lasting investments that will be providing high-paying, very productive jobs in the US. But it wasn't just the support we got from the government. That was critical to keeping us alive. It's what we have done subsequently that really makes a difference. And that's where the UAW has played a very critical role. We could not have achieved the type of productivity gains, the efficiency improvements, the quality improvements, without support on the factory floor from the union. I mean, as was mentioned, I've been at GM for quite a while. I still recall the days when I would tour groups through some of our assembly plants, and all the workers would turn their backs so that to clearly indicate that they were not supportive of management being in the plant. That was a different GM. Now we take tour groups through plants, and a union representative quite often is part of the tour group that explain what goes on in the plant to the visitors. Amazingly, Tom is sitting there. We took a group from Mexico the other day through one of our Flint assembly plants. It used to be that guests from Mexico were completely unwelcome in US and Canadian plants. And, they were welcomed because there was a recognition that Mexico is now an important part of the GM overall global footprint, and that what we do in Mexico benefits the workers in Flint. So we have spent a lot of effort over the last decade or so making those changes. And as they say, it takes a really significant emotional event to get people to overcome years of hostilities. And in a sense, the Great Recession did that for us. That forced both management and labor to recognize that it was time to change. And we did change. So I think, as we go forward, I am very, very confident that the auto industry will continue to be a significant contributor to the overall US economy, to manufacturing jobs, to the introduction of new technologies in the workplace. I mean, in a sense, the auto industry illustrates some of the really positive elements of the US economy and some of the challenges we face. When I joined GM, as I mentioned, our average plant had about 5,000 people working in it. That's down to 2,500 on the average assembly plant. That's quite a change. That's roughly 5% productivity growth per year for over 20 years. Some of that has come from the introduction of new technology. You used to go into the old GM plants or any auto plants, and you'd have people welding the parts of the car together. Much of that is automated. A lot of the work that was really physically difficult, brought people safety into risk, those are the things that have been automated. You can't get away from the fact that a lot of assembly work still has to be done manually. But we've introduced a lot of technology. We've also changed the way we design our cars, manufacture them, all to improve both the efficiency of the plant as well as the safety of the workforce in the plant. And that's going to continue. And this industry has become amazingly global over the last 25 years. So you're beginning to see technology come in from around the world So if Honda or Toyota develop a new way to manufacture, a more efficient way, that quickly gets diffused through all the other auto companies. And similarly, when we develop something, that quickly gets diffused to other companies. But it also means that the United States and North America can compete, even with our high wages, with autos manufactured around the world. In fact, if you look at all the investment that foreign auto companies have made in the US over the last decade, that clearly indicates that the US is now a competitive location for manufacturing products that you're going to sell in the States. But importantly, the US is also becoming an important exporter of automobiles from the United States. This year, we're going to sell a little over 100,000 vehicles from the United States to the Middle East. And these are not just any vehicles. These are our pickup trucks. These are our big SUVs, some of the most profitable vehicles we make. We send the Cadillac SRX to China from Mexico, and soon that will be moving to the States. So it is a global industry. We have to take advantage of global trade, and that's why I spent so much time on many of these trade agreements, trying to make sure that while other foreign auto companies have access to our markets, we get comparable access to their markets, and we spend a lot of time working with the US trade negotiators, with the US Department of Commerce to do that. So in closing, are we out of the recession? I knew we were out of the recession when, as I speak to reporters, they begin to ask me, when is the cycle going to end? Is 16.5 million the peak of this cycle? That certainly indicates that the recession is over. I think this recovery is really sustainable. I think with the right set of policies, we could go on for a number of years growing and growing strongly, because the fundamentals of the industry, the fundamentals of the GM have improved so dramatically that we can compete in a much tougher environment. So I'm very, very optimistic that the industry is on the right track, GM is on the right track, and GM employees' jobs are much more secure, and that we will be adding jobs in this country rather than subtracting from that. Thank you very much, and I'll be happy to take questions after that.
What a great thing to hear. I'm very optimistic that we'll be adding more good-paying jobs in the near future. We shift from good-paying jobs, manufacturing, to low-wage workers and the post-recession economy. And our second commentator is Mary Joyce Carlson. She has been a practicing labor and employment lawyer for 25 years. She currently is serving as the National Counsel to the Fast Food Workers Organizing Committee. She previously served as Deputy General Counsel with the National Labor Relations Board. She served on the Service Employees International Union's negotiating team with two of the largest healthcare corporations in the United States. She also has a wealth of international experience, having been a consultant to the State Department and to a number of labor ministries in Latin America, Asia, and the Middle East. Ms. Carlson's law degree is from Duke University Law School. It's a pleasure to welcome to Chicago-Kent, Mary Joyce Carlson.
Thank you, Marty. It's a pleasure to be here. And I noted when I came in, I think I've not been in a law school in a long time because the seats are so good. I remember when I was in law school, it wasn't very comfortable, but this is very nice. And I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you. It has been my pleasure for the past 3 years to serve as counsel to a campaign that has received a lot of national attention. It's known as sometimes as Fight for 15, sometimes as Fast Food Forward, sometimes as Detroit for 15. But It is a national campaign of workers in the fast food industry whose median wage is below $9 an hour for all positions, cook, cashier, and that is the compensation. We don't have to think about total compensation because that is the compensation. There are no health benefits, there's no paid leave, there's no pension, there's no retirement, there are no other benefits. Now, what is the industry that generates these jobs? Which, by the way, these jobs are some of the jobs that were generated in the top 10 of job generators in the recovery from the recession. The fast food jobs and the retail jobs were jobs that are listed in the B&A, along with home care workers, other low-wage jobs. Who are the companies, and what is the nature of the industry that operates with this workforce? Well, they're global companies, just like General Motors. Yum Brands, which owns Taco Bell, Pizza Hut, Kentucky Fried Chicken, operates in every continent except Antarctica in the world. Burger King, which is owned by a Brazilian investment company, similarly operates all over the world. And McDonald's, headquartered right here in Chicago, also operates on has restaurants that it runs on every continent with the exception of Antarctica. And interestingly enough, both Burger King, McDonald's, well, actually all three, and Yum Brand, but I want to talk about McDonald's specifically because it's a homegrown corporation. McDonald's has collective bargaining agreements and is recognized as, recognizes the unions in the countries it operates in Western Europe, in Latin America, in some countries in Eastern Europe, in China, in Africa, and in the world, with the exception of the United States and Canada. So what are the conditions of the workers who in this industry? First of all, I want to dispel some myths about the workers. These are not teenagers who work in these jobs. There are teenagers who work there, about 25%. The rest of the workers are over the age of 28 years old. At least 40% of them are supporting families. They're rearing children on these wages. There are interesting statistics about their educational level. For those who are over 28, some 70% of them are high school graduates, and 28% of them have some college. There are even 6% of workers in the industry who have college degrees. The vast majority, 55% of the workers are women. They're female. As I said before, their median wage is below $9 an hour. And in this country, their benefits are supplied by the public sector. Here in Chicago, in the state of Illinois, the taxpayers pay $388 million so that the workers in McDonald's can access Medicaid, food stamps, Section 8 housing, and other public benefits. And actually, McDonald's had a helpline for its workforce that the workers could call and learn how to access these programs, these public programs. So rather than paying a wage so that you do not have to live on food stamps, Medicaid, et cetera, the helpline is a substitute for that. And I agree with Jared that we need public policies in this country that support low-wage workers, and I particularly agree that we need a minimum wage raise. But I also believe that there's no reason that these global corporations who are very profitable can't pay a wage that supplies the basic necessities of life. They do in China. I want to talk a minute about the collective bargaining agreement that McDonald's has with the trade union in China. In the collective bargaining agreement, they pay above the minimum wage. There's an agreement to pay above the minimum wage. There's an agreement that the company will pay for the basket of social benefits that the Chinese government provides, which is Social Security, health benefits, pension, and a very interesting benefit for women called fertility leave. And that's both pregnancy leave and also a leave while you're at work to nurse. The company pays for that. They contribute toward that. With regard to leave, after you've worked in McDonald's for 5 years in China, you're entitled to a month of paid leave. Every year, you're entitled to 2 to 5 weeks of paid leave. I was talking about this with a Chinese colleague who's a researcher, and I was explaining to him the conditions of the workers here in this country, and he was stunned. He said, but this is the home country. This is the home country of McDonald's. Not our country, this country. How could it be that the conditions of the workers in the home country are worse than the conditions of the workers in my country? Well, that was an interesting question. I actually believe that these companies comply. They comply with the rules and the social norms and the policies of whatever country they want to enter. So, of course, Yum Brands, McDonald's, Burger King, they want access to the consumers of China. They want access to the consumers of Europe. They want access to the consumers in Latin America. So if there's a strong social system in place, they'll comply with that. In this country, we do not have a strong social system. What we've decided in this country is matters such as the setting of wages, with the exception of the minimum, access to health care until recently, whether or not you have a pension other than Social Security, is a matter of a private concern, not public concern. And that works, that might work if the workers here had the ability and were organized and had the power to contend in the private sector for their share of the economic pie. And this is related to the point that Jared made about the decline of collective bargaining. Sometimes people say to me, they ask, in fact, Marty asked last night, what is the point of this campaign? Let me just ask, how many people have seen something about this campaign on television? How many people have seen something about it on Jon Stewart, who I think is the Walter Cronkite of our generation? So this campaign has, one good thing about it is that I think it has wide access to the public. And I actually believe it's made a contribution to the debate around income inequality. The demand of the campaign is $15 an hour and the right to organize a union without retaliation. Now, Peter Orr is here. You know we're supposed to have that right in the statute. But we're making the demand because, unfortunately, the promise of the statute is not the practice in the real world. So what is the point? The point is not, we hope the minimum wage is raised, and we're happy that Connecticut raised the minimum wage 2 weeks ago to $10.10 an hour. We're happy that Maryland raised it to their minimum wage 2 days ago to $10.10 an hour. But the point of this campaign is to organize these workers so that they can improve, they can bargain, they can improve their lives. We can raise standards in this industry. There's really no reason that a profitable global industry cannot raise standards at the workplace. And the reality of the money that's spent on branding and the happy faces that are on television, the Happy Meals, the Happy Ronald McDonald, this is not This is not the condition of the women who are in this workforce. The wages are very interesting to me. The wage at McDonald's in Blue Ridge, Georgia, which is a tiny town in North Georgia, are $7.25 an hour, current minimum wage. Until recently, the wage in Manhattan for the McDonald's workers was $7.25 an hour. Now, you have a higher minimum here in Chicago, so things are a little better here. In Blue Ridge, Georgia, at least you can rent a double wide for $200 a month. In Manhattan, you can't do anything on $7.25 an hour. And so many of the workers that I meet in Manhattan live in homeless shelters. What kind of global industry doesn't pay workers a sufficient wage that they can rent a place to eat? It's rent a place to live. It's a shame. What kind of global industry doesn't pay a sufficient wage so that families have to access food stamps? So I'm glad that that we're creating jobs now in our economy. I'm happy to know that the recovery is underway, and there's new statistics about job creation. But I think one of the fundamental things that we have to grapple with in this country is what kind of jobs, what is the quality of the job, what's the quality of the pay, what's offered to the workers. And this sort of thing has got to have a boost, both in terms of accessing collective bargaining and also certainly in terms of public policy around minimum wage. I just got a note that says that I have only 3 minutes left. And what I would say in this 3 minutes is we're going to win this campaign. And we're going to change the lives of a significant sector of workers in a major global industry. And just the fact that we're going to change the lives of people in a branded industry that is known as well as any will make a difference, I believe, in lifting up collective bargaining as a solution to the problems of low-wage work. So I'm optimistic too, but in a different way. And it's wonderful. These workers they're wonderful. In Detroit, some of the workers used to work in the auto industry. I've met families of mothers and sons who had been formerly in the auto industry and now are in a fast food restaurant because that's where they could find a job in Detroit. I've met workers who want to go back to college and who want a work schedule so that they can leave the job and go back to college. But look at how many of these workers have some college. I know people are really big on training, but if you have all this college education and all you can do is make $8 an hour and access food stamps and live in a homeless shelter, what good is the training doing? So anyway, I hope that you'll think when you leave about this particular segment of the workforce, that you will look kindly on them, and you also would feel proud to be a part of changing the standards in their industry. Thank you.
So I'm technologically illiterate. Okay, this is on. So in addition to giving us tremendous food for thought, our speakers also gave us a nice period for dialogue with all of you. So let's open the floor for Q&A. And we've got Valerie with a roving mic. We've got someone right over there. And I'll repeat the question for those who are joining us on the internet.
This question is primarily for Dr. Bernstein, but I'm interested in what everyone has to say. I'm interested in sort of the moral hazard problem and the too big to fail problem. This is something that you hear out on the street, actually. If you go to demonstrations, you'll hear people say the banks got bailed out, we got sold out. But you also hear some people in Washington using language about the too big to fail problem. I think of like Bernie Sanders, for example. So my question is, where do you think we stand on that? Because I mean, from my perspective, it seems like a lot of people who made a lot of bad decisions got a ton of money with no strings attached, and the banks and the financial industry is consolidating. There's no real incentive to, have any kind of, care or concern about the average worker, the average person. It's all about money, 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 with no consequences, too big to fail, moral hazard. So I'm just sort of curious how you feel about that issue and where that's going.
The question is your thoughts, Dr. Bernstein, on the problem of moral hazard and being too big to fail.
Okay, so just to be clear, moral hazard is a concept in economics that happens when someone within an economy doesn't face the, basically when the costs of their behavior is not reflected in price. Moral hazard occurs, and the concern is that if you can do things that don't redound, if you can do things that are bad for the broader economy, create negative externalities that don't redound to you in terms of some sort of pecuniary loss, you're more likely to do those things, and that is problematic. It's an old insurance problem. If you give people insurance against fires, they'll smoke in bed. But we're talking about banks here. If the banks had just smoked a cigarette in the bed, it wouldn't have been so bad. It's actually a little worse than, I thought your question was very well framed, but in my view, it's even a little worse than that. Because it's not just that the banks, and I don't mean all of them, but it's not just that a set of large financial institutions behaved in reckless ways in terms particularly of their lending. So they deeply underpriced risk. They very much over-leveraged. They borrowed against they borrowed against a very inadequate capital holdings or capital base, so they were over-leveraged. But once the bubble burst and the economy imploded, and we had this very deep recession, we finally managed to pass some financial reform to help reduce the moral hazard and the too big to fail problem. But by that time, the financial sector was largely recovered, and they've been fighting against the reform efforts. So in that sense, it's worse than either. The analogy I had is that we in the government were kind of driving along the road, and we saw this Doberman Pinscher that had been hit by a car, and it was bleeding on the side of the road, and we nursed it back to health, and then it attacked us. So I think there's a problem there, and I think that unless we implement, which it isn't, Dodd-Frank financial reform is not fully implemented, and in fact, there are many of the component regulations to it that can be implemented in ways, the Volcker Rule is a good example, that can be implemented in ways that would help reduce the systemic risk you're talking about. And by the way, the issue is less too big to fail than too systemically linked to fail. Lehman was not that big a bank, but when it failed, it brought down lots of the economy with it because it was so systemically linked. So the question is less size and much more systemic connectivity. And there's a lot of that in the financial sector. And the key to resolving it is the kinds of financial reforms that are in Dodd-Frank, of which I would say the most important one, and I'll stop here, if I were going to do one, Tim Geithner used to talk about this, if I were going to do one thing that would help get to the root of your question and help dampen moral hazard, too systemically connected to fail, doesn't sound as good as too big to fail, but I think that's the right words, too connected to fail, here's what I would do. I would have quite significant capital reserve requirements. I would have regulations that would not, that by fiat would prohibit banks from over-leveraging. Their capital requirements that they had to have in the base of their equity that they hold on their books would have to be large enough so that they couldn't leverage up to 30, 40, 60 times the multiples of their capital base. I would have historical leverages have been somewhere in the 15, maybe to 30 times rate. And I would keep that very low. I think that you can get a lot of other parts of this wrong, but if you get that part right, you're much less exposed to the kind of problems the questioner is raising.
I have a question for Dr. Bernstein. The studies that the government and the think tanks that have done showing the expansion of employment, particularly in the high-wage areas, has there been any thought given to the fact that many of the, quote, high-wage industries, including automobile, are actually two-tier wage industries, so that the starting people, and I think we've seen this down in Tennessee right now with the campaign that is going on with Volkswagen, if you look at the starting wages of those people, they are nothing like what the industry used to produce, and indeed the industry isn't producing it anymore. And it seems to me that the only place where we don't have two-tier is in the executive suite.
The question is commentary on the trend or two-tier wage structures in auto and other manufacturing and the impact that has on your evaluation.
Sure. I'll comment on that, and I'd like to invite Mustafa, if he's interested as well, to comment on that, because he talked, and he knows these data. He talked about wage trends in the industry that seem to me quite germane to your question. I very much agree with the spirit of where you're going. While I think Mustafa correctly, very correctly points out that wages in manufacturing tend to be above average in general, and autos clearly above average. If you look at the trend of manufacturing wages, and even manufacturing employment, by the way, and I'm talking the whole sector, not just the autos, I don't see anything there that is particularly exciting. In fact, if you look over the past year, I just did this calculation the other day, employment in the manufacturing sector, the sector is still about 9% of total employment, but its contribution over the past year to growth has only been 3%. So while I think there's a good auto stories to tell that Mustafa was telling us, I do think the kind of problems that the question suggests, that the quality of jobs within the sector, I can't speak, again, I'll let Mustafa speak to auto specifically, but the quality of jobs within the manufacturing sector on a wage basis are not as high as they've been in the past, in no small part due to the tiering. Now, the one thing that's different, though, while the wage component has suffered from the dynamics that you've described, typically it's still a sector that comes with better benefits than the kinds of jobs that Mary Joyce was talking about. Now, I think even in the Tier 1 agreements, there's more compensation to the package than just the wage. So there's an important difference between the low end of the service sector and sort of the lower end of the manufacturing sector. That said, I think your question and what you intimate in your question is correct.
I think one has to be careful because we are in a global industry and have to compete globally. And let's face it, if you go back to 2007, 2008, wages and compensation in the auto industry was way out of line with wages and compensation in any other industry in the US. The challenge we faced was how do you get compensation more in line with the manufacturing norms in the US, but having existing workers that had been receiving a much higher level of compensation. So between the companies and the unions, it was agreed that people that were already on the labor force would continue to receive the compensation that they were getting. But as we hired new people, they would come in at a lower compensation level. But lower is a relative term. I mean, new incoming workers make $18 to $20 an hour with full benefits at GM. So it's not like, you've all of a sudden taken people that were making slightly over $30 an hour in wages and nearly $40 an hour in compensation and said, now you're down to 20. It's a transitional arrangement where you do have lower starting wages with both prospects of higher wages for those as they grow into the jobs, as well as benefits that come with the GM manufacturing job. So I think, and it wasn't something that was imposed by the companies. It was a collectively bargained result. And at least at this point, it appears that it's been quite successful because the industry has been adding substantial number of jobs. As I said, we account for about 3% of GDP and have contributed about 13% of the job growth.
I wanted to thank Mustafa for helping me segue into my question, and it concerns policy and a little bit about the systemic structure of the economy in this country. So you said compensation of the average auto worker was a little out of line. And my question is, we have a situation here with a governor, a Republican governor running, who has a net worth of $500 million, who earned in the end of 2012 $53 million. And along with his running mate, have vowed to destroy public employee unions and private sector unions. And we have a situation where we have a mayor who is determined to bust our unions and reduce the pensions of workers who spent their lives earning that vested benefit. At the same time, I'm sure he has 3, 4, 5 pensions from the White House, Jared, right? Chief of Staff, from his hedge fund. So unless we address this as a matter of policy, and a CEO with a starting salary of $10, $20 million a year at GM, while workers on the line were reduced from $40 an hour to $20, and the average CEO salary starting at, $50 million? Unless we address those kind of issues, how can we talk about really distributing wealth to the workers who create the value that give your corporations on a global level the capital, the surplus value, and your profits?
Let me see if I can
Good luck with that.
summarize that. I think the gist of the question is for commentary on the gap between the compensation in the executive suite and the compensation on the line.
I mean, I'll start. First of all, the gap that you reference quite accurately in a very granular way, talking about some individuals, is, as you've seen in my presentation, very evident in the data, and even more so than I showed. The share of national income, if you take all the income in the economy, the share that's going to profits, as I mentioned, was higher than it's ever been. The share that's going to wages is the lowest it's been since before I was born. I was born back in the 1950s. So you're talking about a real problem, and I'd like to offer 2 solutions. Actually, 3, but I won't talk about the third because it's the minimum wage, and Mary Joyce has that covered. I'd like to talk about 2 solutions. One is more collective bargaining. I mean, I associate unions historically, and by the way, this is not just free association, there's lots of evidence for this, with a more equitable distribution of profitability in much the way you say. And in that sense, the 2-tier question that came up earlier from the gentleman is somewhat upsetting, because there's always, and there are people in the room far more experienced than me in this realm, but I've always associated collective bargaining and unionization in this wage distribution space as being one of solidarity, wherein you worked for a fairer slice of the pie. But the diminished collective bargaining and the attacks on unions that you cited is absolutely, I think, designed to protect the kind of inequitable wealth distribution that we've seen. So that's one. The second would be more progressive taxation. Our tax system, particularly if you look at corporate taxation, is kind of a mess. Now, we happen to have a very high statutory corporate tax rate relative to the rest of the world, but there's so many exemptions and loopholes. I read the other day that GE, not GM, GE, has 1,000 tax lawyers. I mean, I thought they made stuff. Apparently they make tax breaks. Amidst all this corporate profitability, corporate revenues as a share of GDP are among the lowest they've ever been. So I would argue more progressive taxation, more collective bargaining, higher minimum wages are good solutions to the problem you raise.
I think you also have to be very careful, and I'm going to be an economist and a conservative Chicago-trained economist. As I said, GM has a collective bargaining agreement with unions in 40 different countries, and virtually all our manufacturing facilities are covered by collective bargaining agreements. So, and we tend to be a premium payer virtually everywhere. I think last time I looked at the data, which was 2012, GM wages were about, depending on the country, anywhere from 160 to 210% of the manufacturing average. So I'm very proud of that, and I think we do a good job on that. Having said that, it's relatively easy to talk about some people who have become very wealthy and say they didn't create the wealth, somebody else did. The fact is, if you look at US wealth creation, it's been mostly created by entrepreneurs. And, you know, it's the Apples, Steve Jobs, it's Microsoft's Bill Gates, Warren Buffett with his investments, Yahoo, you name all these companies that have come up in the US that are new, they've created a lot of wealth, and they've been able to keep a lot of their wealth. Now, maybe you want some progressive taxation, but do you want to get into countries that are not creating that level of wealth, you know, that we have? I mean, as I try to explain to my friends in Japan, what's the difference between the Japanese economy and the US economy? If you look at the top 25 companies that were in the Fortune 500 in 1950, 1960, 1970 in the US, less than a third are there now. They've been replaced by newer companies coming in. You don't find that anywhere else in the world. So our system encourages a lot of wealth creation, and we allow people to keep that wealth. So I think before we start saying somebody is unfairly grabbing the wealth, you ought to look at the source of that wealth that has been created in the US.
Let me push back a little bit on some of those points.
Sure.
Because it's not at all an unreasonable set of comments, but I think that there is a difference between arguing that those who are contributing more to the national pie by dint of their entrepreneurial genius in some cases, and certainly efforts in other cases. There's a difference between saying they should do better than everyone else, and the fact that the share of growth that they now claim is the highest it's been since the late 1920s. So, I mean, if one followed your argument through, Mustafa, you could justify any level of wealth concentration by just kind of the Chicago school assumption that if whatever you're getting paid, that's what you're worth. And I think that there's two problems with that. One, at the low end, and I'll just cite Mary Joyce's comments, that there are quite clearly people not getting paid what they're worth, I think, at the low end. But also, at the high end, there's been considerable studies. And I'm trying to learn more about this literature. I think it's actually quite important, that have tried to understand why these entrepreneurs who used to claim, you know, it used to be the case that the top 1% held something like 12% of the wealth, now they hold 20% of the wealth. So what is it that explains that? Is it their greater innovation, or is it more sort of luck, the structure of returns, the suppressing of unions, the decline in the minimum wage, the other factors that we've been talking? And it turns out that there's a fair bit of the latter, that these folks very much contribute to disproportionate growth, but that above what they're sort of historically normal returns, there's a set of extra normal returns that seem to be related to the ability to kind of manipulate finance in ways that build on their assets that don't seem related to what you and I would call marginal product.
Jared, I think this is probably a longer debate than we have time for. But the fact is, take a company like a Yahoo, take a company like an Apple that has generated tremendous wealth, and some of the other companies that are coming up. They tend not to have very many employees, and they tend to have very mobile employees. If you tried to unionize an Apple or a Yahoo, you'd probably lose their entire labor force, besides the fact that they're very highly compensated. The issue is that the wealth that's being generated in the US economy is in sectors that are very entrepreneurial, very highly mobile, and you're not going to be able to clamp them down. So it's not like you're dealing with the GMs and the Caterpillars and the GEs that had these huge factories where you could unionize those workforces. That's not where the growth in income and growth in wealth in the US is coming right now. So it's a changed structure of the economy, and the question is, if we don't like the outcome, what changes would you make?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to be, I take where you're coming from. I think what Mustafa is kind of saying, at least to my ears, is like, certainly you don't want to kill the golden goose. And I take that point. I guess my response would be two things. First of all, if you look at, I don't know so much about Apple, but at Microsoft, apparently there's a core group of workers who are, in fact, very much, as you described, paid very well. And then there's the periphery, many of whom are contingent workers who I don't know, who don't do nearly as well. To me, that's a good example of a structural change, an institutional or structural change in the way the workforce is structured in such a way as to reduce the compensation of workers at a very profitable company. I also want to say, this I'm quite clear from the data, if you actually, if the international comparisons are quite clear, that if these companies are taxed at a slightly higher rate, I don't think you will kill the golden goose. I think you'll actually generate more revenues that could be used for some of the ideas that Mary and others were, and I was espousing.
So I hesitate to jump in here, but we are out of time. What I want to do is give each of our panelists about 90 seconds to sum up or any concluding remarks that they have. So we'll start with Dr. Mahatran.
One of the concerns I have is that a lot of this debate that's taking place in the US on minimum wage, inequality, labor force structure is ignoring what we should have learned from experiences in other countries. You take Germany, for example. It's right now probably the developed country with the strongest labor market. But if you went a decade ago, Germans were paranoid that they were not creating jobs, they were losing workforce. They came up with something called the Hartz Plan, in which they took a full look at the entire structure of the labor force. Why were the young people not getting jobs? Why was there not enough mobility in the German economy? And they addressed those systematically to the point where today, Germany is a very different labor market than it was 10, 12 years ago. And it wasn't just mandated by the government or companies. Germans have probably the strongest labor unions in the world. So what we really need to do is look at the experience. And the European countries went through this debate and implemented policies long before we did. And they've come back and reevaluated, and many have changed. I mean, England has changed its labor law, UK has changed its labor laws. Germany, as I said, changed under the Hartz Plan. Netherlands changed their policies. But we need to learn from the experience of these countries as they try to address some of the issues that we're trying to look at and address. And they did that in a system where the government is obviously much more responsible for the social well-being of the population, have very strong unions. In fact, many of these changes were made by left-of-center governments. So I think we need to learn from there rather than trying to think nobody else has confronted this problem and we got to come up with solutions. Let's not make the mistakes that were made in Europe before, and because corrective measures are very difficult to implement too.
Ms. Carlson.
Well, I would agree with that there is a lot for us to learn from other countries, but I'm not sure that Germany, France are creating companies like Yahoo. And I'm not sure those are growing in those economies. But I think it's better. It's a better situation in Germany. It's a better situation in France, where you develop policies that looks at the community as a whole and the workforce as a whole and the standard of living of everyone. And there is a minimum standard below which the whole society just won't tolerate it. And that's what's missing here. We don't have a standard that is intolerable. it appears to me. I mean, when we're willing to tolerate mothers and children living in homeless shelters who go to work every day, get all the hours that they can get, they make a wage, but as a society we're willing to tolerate that, that means that we don't have the same will that the Germans had to evaluate their system and to develop policies and to implement laws. And yes, Germany has strong trade unions, but you know what? Germany has a whole set of social protections, and Germany has rules around co-determination in the workplace and participation in the workplace. So I am a fan. I think that's something that we need here. And I hope that we can get from here to there, but frankly, there has to be a change in the philosophical outlook of people in this country, and a change in evaluating and demanding a certain kind of society. And as long as things are just left to the private, in the private sector, I don't see that we're going to move forward on this.
Dr. Bernstein.
So there is no, what is the Winston Churchill line? Capitalism is the worst form of an economy except for all the other ones. I think there is no better form of organizing an economy than the kind of capitalism that exists in advanced economies today. Simply by dint of their being advanced should be enough proof of that statement. But I would argue that American-style capitalism is actually in more trouble than we think. If you think about that line I showed, where 90% of wage earners received very little in terms of real increases, except for a few periods there of 3 and 4 years, you start to get a sense of, I think, the urgency in Mary Joyce's closing comments, that if we're going to preserve what I view in many ways, and I know Mustafa would very much underscore this, is a system that is innovative, a system that generates employment gains, profitability, earnings, historically living standards increase, but is a system that has not been working for quite a while now for more folks than it has been helping. And that has to be solved. Now, I've given some ideas today in terms of its solution. I've talked about more collective bargaining, higher minimum wages, more progressive taxation, the importance of full employment, the role of the Federal Reserve, fiscal policy to create more employment. I started my talk and ended my talk with an emphasis on policy. And the idea of all of that policy is to strengthen the economy, strengthen the job market, strengthen the distribution of growth, so that we can preserve what I believe is fundamentally the best economic system in the world, but is also, at this time, fundamentally broken.
Thank you. Please join with me in thanking this incredible panel, and thanks to all of you.
Enjoy meeting you.
Pleasure meeting you.